June 2015, Deer Island, Massachusetts. A woman walking her dog on the shoreline discovers a plastic bag which appears to have been washed up by the tide.
At that time, we didn't even know if this was a little boy or a little girl. All we knew was that it was a child probably under the age of 5.
People were outraged. Outraged.
The bag contains the remains of a young girl, but police are initially unsure of her race and ethnicity.
There's some level of decomposition of her body, and that's really all we had to go on at that point.
It's not like we could release a photograph of her. We had to actually generate a picture of her, and it needed to be accurate.
Using advanced Photoshop techniques, a statewide campaign to ascertain her identity and the manner in which she died soon becomes a nationwide cause célèbre.
The fact that she remained unidentified for 3 months was very unique. We usually see a child that is recovered, deceased, identified quickly, within hours.
People just couldn't fathom how a little girl could have been discarded like trash.
Within 3 months, there's a breakthrough in the case. But what follows is a complex investigation into a tragic event.
We received more leads and more tips than any case that I've ever worked on.
I'd say a good couple of hundred, or very close to that, were very viable, promising leads, and every one of them had to be chased down.
We were definitely looking for a needle in the haystack.
This is the story of Baby Doe, how police discovered her real identity, and how forensics and 21st century technology were at the heart of solving the case.
A 2-year-old child ends up deceased and in a trash bag and lies there for 84 days and no one even calls and no one even misses her, then we have a problem.
Like so many crime stories, this one begins with the discovery of a body by someone walking their dog. But in this case, the body was that of a young child, estimated to be between the age of 2 and 4, and the state of the remains meant she was unidentifiable. Deer Island is a peninsula in Boston, Massachusetts, located right across the harbor from the city. It's the site of the second largest wastewater treatment plant in the United States and is a popular spot for walkers and bikers.
It's a nice recreational area, as well as home to our wastewater treatment plant.
Surrounded by a really lovely park and used by a lot of residents to take long walks along the ocean side.
It's really done nicely, and people go out there and use the walking path and so forth.
When a dog stopped at a plastic bag close to the shore on the afternoon of June the 25th, 2015, the dog's owner made a gruesome discovery.
The dog sniffed it out, the woman took a look and realized that there was a body inside and called police. And of course, within a few hours of realizing that the body of a child. Within hours, there were police investigators and a lot of people around, and the media all showed up and watched this horror begin to unfold.
It's always difficult to work in cases involving the death of a child. So the fact that it was a child was particularly upsetting.
A very small child, a little girl, who appeared to be deceased, wrapped in some blankets, abandoned there on the beach.
The body was unidentifiable, except for a pair of white leggings with a polka dot pattern and a zebra print blanket, which was also inside the bag.
So the little girl was wearing leggings that became of particular interest to us as the case developed.
It's a plastic bag and some blankets and a very small child, a girl, approximately 3 or 4 years old.
Given the uniqueness of the case, investigators had to start from scratch and look at every possible line of inquiry.
There was searches, both on land and in the water. We had canine, we had air wing, we had divers.
Additional troopers from the state police were requested to assist in a canvass of the area. Just a large-scale response from detectives, as well as documenting the scene, photographing, videotaping, etc.
We searched once the tide went back out again. You check for cameras, you check for witnesses. The body is thoroughly documented and checked, and then the body ends up going to the office of the medical examiner for further evaluation. Once it goes back to a lab, they would do some very extensive testing to try to see what we could recover, whether there be hairs or fibers or anything that could possibly contain DNA or fingerprints or anything like that. The bag was checked for fingerprints and for DNA, and then every square inch of her body and every square inch of everything else that was contained in the bag was thoroughly examined.
The body had begun to decompose and become bloated, and so it was impossible to identify it visually. Decomposition had also made it impossible to collect fingerprints as a result of exposure to the water.
Her body was taken to the office of the chief medical examiner for an autopsy. In this case, it was very difficult because of the level of decomposition to determine precisely what caused her death.
Remember, by the time she showed up on Deer Island, she was already been deceased for a month, and she'd been in the salt water for all that time. She had already started to decompose. Most homicide cases, the cause of death is fairly obvious. You have a fairly obvious sign of trauma. In this case, we had none of those things. We had no identification. We had no obvious cause of death. And in the case of a 2-year-old little girl, that's about as difficult as it gets. So all of our resources were geared towards identifying her at first. That was crucial. Without her identification and no information about her past, her family history, her medical history, there was nothing we could do to determine how she died. That was very important. We had to ID her.
It appears that the child died from either asphyxiation or perhaps from blows to her chest, which caused irregular heartbeats and perhaps a loss of cardiac functioning and so forth. So we're able to ascertain some microscopic pollen, for example, that was on her body and things of this nature. So quite a bit of processing of the child's body was done by the chief medical examiner.
There was also some debate among the investigators as to whether the body had been placed at the scene or had washed up ashore.
Our first challenge was to try to make a determination on whether the body was actually dumped there on land or whether it had washed up from the water. So that was obviously a big part of the investigation, was to determine how she showed up there. The drift analysis gave us an idea of where she could have come from if she had come up from the water.
A drift analysis is something that we go to the Coast Guard for their expertise, but it's basically what it sounds like, the drift pattern of the ocean. It's a reverse drift analysis, so it would indicate or give us a general idea of where things came from.
For the moment, the whole case was shrouded in mystery. But what were the circumstances surrounding the death of this little girl? And crucially, who had been involved in what was now a murder case? Detectives now increased the pace of their inquiries and intensified the hunt for new forensic information, which they hoped her clothing might reveal.
She's not on anybody's data list. You have to have an accurate picture. It was, clear to us that we were definitely looking for a needle in the haystack.
When a body is found, an autopsy is requested immediately. So autopsies are conducted, fingerprints, DNA analysis, CODIS analysis, anything that we can identify a body with through blood or any medical records.
Investigators quickly moved to have the body and the clothing undergo a specific forensic procedure known as pollen analysis.
The pollen analysis gave us encouragement because the pollen analysis indicated that the child had spent a significant portion of her life living in the Boston area or around areas where plant growth, pollen that was produced, was native and common to the Boston area.
Detectives also conducted a parallel investigation into the source of Baby Doe's clothing tracking it using its barcode.
That outfit ended up being part of a two-piece set that was sold at Target. And it was sold in this area for a brief period of time, and there wasn't a whole lot of sales. So we were able to generate a list of all of the traceable sales, and in the end, that was very helpful in identifying her.
We sent out thousands of individual subpoenas for each transaction, and each door that we knocked on, we were hoping to identify the parents or someone who had at one point known or could help us identify Baby Doe.
The police also engaged with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also known as NCMEC, who have collated lists and information on children reported missing across the United States, in the hope they could find Baby Doe's true identity.
We reached out for Carol Schweitzer from that agency, and looking back on it now, that was probably the best decision we made that day.
We got our initial phone call from Trooper Dan Herman.
An unidentified child, it made sense at the time to contact the National Center immediately.
What he said is that they had a young child recovered on the beach of Deer Island, which was just outside of Boston Harbor, and he was looking for assistance to see if NCMEC was aware of any child matching that description that had been reported to the National Center. We went into our database, we opened a file, and we started to preliminary search our records to see what cases we had active of children that would match that description, and started to read through those case details to see if any stood out that could be sent over to the state police immediately for follow-up.
When it became evident as time went on that we realized that there was no immediate missing child from our area, I provided the center with some photographs, some close photographs of the child, as well as a description of the child.
She had already started to decompose, and it's not like we could release a photograph of her. We had to actually generate a picture of her, and it needed to be accurate.
By the next morning, I was consulting with Christy and our forensic artist on trying to get the initial facial reconstruction completed, what information they needed. So there was a lot of just over the phone and email communication between the National Center and the state police within those first 24 hours.
It didn't surprise me because I'd been familiar with the sketch artist works before. I know in other cases as well. I mean, it's amazing the 3D imaging that they're able to use from some of the most basic things like a child's skull.
Forensic artist Christy Andrews was recruited to draw up a composite in the hope of identifying the unknown child. Using advanced digital photo composition and 3D design, she began to work to recreate Baby Doe's features from the information the Boston police were able to give her.
The composite that I did of Baby Doe, I did in the span of a couple hours. The medical examiner actually sent us back some feedback with new information that her hair was longer than I had initially made, and that she also had pierced ears, which we didn't have at first, and they definitely wanted to show that because that's an identifying feature of a person. So went back and did those edits, gave her longer hair, gave her pierced ears. I remember them telling me she had a little red hairband that was tied in a little ponytail on top of her head, so be sure to show that. Her remains were too decomposed to use the actual photos to more or less clean up in Photoshop. I studied her face to kind of get a feel for how I thought her facial features were. So if I need to make certain sections smaller or larger, I can go in and move individual pieces around and make those adjustments. And then once I'm satisfied with the features, I start building in the next feature. So then I pull the mouth in, and then I go in, pull the ears in, making sure that they sit on her face properly. They're following, again, that proportion guide, and then I place the eyebrows. And then we take stock photos of hair and clothing and earrings. because that was an identifying feature. And then our logo goes on top of it and it goes out.
The CGI reconstructed face of Baby Doe was released on July the 2nd, 2015. NCMEC also digitally enhanced images of the leggings and the blanket found with the remains and created a poster featuring them on their website.
What we saw there in Baby Doe was a precious little, beautiful little girl. And we broadcast that image on our website, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. We broadcast it on the Massachusetts State Police website. We put it out through Twitter and Facebook.
Notifying all the media outlets, all the TV stations, all the newspapers, all the publications within the state of Massachusetts to its totality, to help push that information out to the public.
The details of the case and of Baby Doe was also entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System on July the 4th, with particular attention being taken to cross-reference with details of some notable unsolved missing children cases. A press conference displaying the reconstruction and the enhanced images of the clothing and blanket was later held at the location where the body was found.
The image, such a lifelike image of this little girl, stuck with a lot of people, and it received a lot of attention.
People just couldn't fathom how a little girl could have been discarded like trash. We had people calling into the station. I mean, there was a frantic search for several weeks to find out any sort of information about this little girl. You had parents, you had teachers, you had moms, you had dads, you had people who didn't even have kids that were upset and outraged that this little girl, one wasn't identified. No one knew who she was.
We received more leads and more tips than any case that I've ever worked on. Hundreds of tips were being received via email, social media, phone calls, calls to other police agencies, and all of these tips immediately needed to be categorized and inventoried, and we needed to make sure that all of these tips were looked into.
People were calling numerous times a day. They were concerned that that little girl that was in the composite was someone that they knew and someone that they had loved. And they were hysterical that that was someone that they were connected to.
Over the course of the investigation, that image on social media alone was shared over 50 million times, which is something that we had never seen before.
I went home for the long weekend, and when I came back, it had spread like wildfire, and it had about 65 million shares. I was floored. I don't think NCMEC at that point had seen a social media post be shared that many times.
Meanwhile, at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, work on the case was ramping up.
We had a lot of highs before in this investigation where we're like, this sounds really good, we're all going out, this is gonna be her, and then, you know, follow-up is done and it's not Baby Doe, and she remained unidentified.
Detectives then employed an additional forensic examination, isotope testing.
Isotope testing is looking at the geochemical makeup of your bones. These are carbon and oxygen and nitrogen that stay within your bones, your teeth, your hair, based on the drinking water and the local food that everybody consumes.
The isotope, most likely due to the deterioration and the decay of the body, was inconclusive.
Investigators were now able to say the DNA profile of Baby Doe was no match for anything registered to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database. By late August, investigators had set up a 24-hour hotline for those with information on the case to call. A text hotline was also created. Despite a huge promotional campaign and hundreds of responses, investigators were no closer to the truth. As the 3-month anniversary of Baby Doe's discovery approached, it looked like the police were further than ever from learning her identity or the circumstances of her death.
Who would do this to any 3-year-old girl, let alone one as beautiful as the one whose image was on billboards all over the city, all over New England.
I'm a father of 2 young boys, and yes, it was something that was emotional.
In the 3rd week of September, however, the long-awaited breakthrough came. After receiving a tip-off, Lieutenant Dan Herman called NCMEC with some vital information.
The tip was, it was a lifelong friend of somebody associated with this child, and they came forward with information that helped us identify who the child was and who her mother was.
He was able to provide me the name of the child that the tipster came in with, and he asked for me to search the spreadsheet of leads that we had been maintaining to see if she had been reported to us in the past. And so all that information was searched, and I didn't find anything, and so I was able to relay back to him, like, no, this is the first time we're hearing this name.
Dan Herman was back on the phone within an hour.
He called back and he's like, this is it. It was just one of those moments where we had been waiting for 3 months to hear her name, and the moment that he said it, we all knew that this was going to be her.
Police then moved rapidly to search premises associated with the suspects that they were now focusing on.
When we identified that that was the spot that we were indeed interested in, a search warrant was prepared, and within 24 hours a search warrant was executed at that apartment.
The apartment was located in Dorchester, a working-class neighborhood in South Boston.
We found no one home when we came into the apartment, and just looking around, it appeared to me an apartment that a child at one point did live in.
On the floor, in a pile of clothes, was the tunic top that we were looking for.
It was part of a 2-piece clothing set that was sold at Target stores in the area. And this outfit had been identified through our investigation, and that top was something that was of significant importance to us.
Police collected items from the apartment with the hope of establishing a link.
Recovered items like toothbrushes and stuff like that that actually contained DNA that matched up with the child that we referred to as Baby Doe.
Finally, police had a link and a name for the deceased child.
We were able to identify that Baby Doe was in fact Bella Bond through DNA testing that proved her identity.
Bella, it transpired, was the daughter of Rachelle Bond and a man called Joe Amoroso. Rachelle had told her story to Michael Sprinsky, a friend of her current partner, Michael McCarthy.
They had met outside of a convenience store, and Rachelle was ranting about something and had actually mentioned having killed her daughter with Michael McCarthy.
She's like, I'm never gonna see her again. I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, oh, McCarthy killed her. I knew she was serious because that's not normal conversation for anybody to just come out and say, but she really wasn't that sad about it. I called my sister to say that I just heard the craziest thing I ever heard in my life. This girl is saying that McCarthy killed her kid, and I know she's serious. And I called Mike immediately after that, and I was like, Mike, tell me where the kid is. I'm like, you're a scumbag. I'm like, you killed a kid, and he doesn't say, wait. She's dead or nothing like that. All he said was, oh, you're gonna believe some cracked out hooker? My sister sent me, it was a rendition of the billboard, the hair, like the face. I mean, it wasn't exact, but if you knew Bella, you would have known right away. As soon as I looked at it, I knew. And like I dropped to my knees. I couldn't believe it.
When those who had been involved in the case saw photos of Bella, the likeness with the photo composite was both uncanny and emotional.
The obvious things like hair length and eye color and complexion were spot on, but what struck me was the structure of the face and cheeks, and the general appearance of the child was very accurate.
If you thought you were upset at seeing this sketch of this little girl who had died, seeing the real life picture of her was even more heartbreaking.
You see this little face and you recognize it kind of looking back at you, even though it was the first time I saw her, you know, it was instant recognition. That's the face I had been working on. That's the face I've been looking at all summer.
Baby Doe, it appeared, had been living in a very unstable environment.
Bella was conceived in an Occupy Boston encampment.
Within months of its establishment, Boston's version of the movement against economic inequality was in disarray.
At the time, on one hand, the Occupy movement had dubbed itself to be a place where it was supposed to be about, you know, the 99%, but it really had sort of disintegrated into homeless people, drug addictions, hanging out outside of South Station. It was disorganized. It had become a safety hazard. To know that Baby Doe was conceived in that really struck a chord with people. It made them even more angry. Rochelle Bond was on drugs for years. She was a known drug addict. Michael McCarthy was a known drug addict. And somehow to believe that these two people could have created a safe and healthy home for a little girl, I mean, there was no way.
Rochelle had lived in Massachusetts and had spent a significant amount of time in area shelters within the Boston area. We found out that she had a drug dependency and issues with homelessness and her health.
She says that she became homeless at a very young age, that she ended up becoming a prostitute. Her children were taken away from her because of drug abuse.
She had lost custody of older children, long since passed, because of her addiction and her neglect of those children. By most accounts, outside of this relationship with Michael McCarthy, she was taking care of this girl.
She got some help from the city, she got some help from the state, she had an apartment which was clean and relatively new, she had support for herself and for Bella. People in the apartment building could hear her always talking to the child, reading to the child, singing to the child, making a real effort to be a good mother.
Bella, happy second birthday, monkey! Yay!
She was a beautiful child. She was always smiling and playing and happy.
She'd had interaction with child services who'd been monitoring her, knowing her history.
I had concluded that, you know, at least up to a certain point anyways, that Bella was doing okay and did not require their direct and immediate attention any further.
There weren't any red flags raised.
Things were going well, it appeared, until Michael McCarthy comes along.
Michael McCarthy was someone that was raised in South Boston.
At some point, he turned to drugs and became heavily involved in heroin. Once that happened, he changed completely.
It was so bad that he had abscesses and deformities on his forearms from just injecting himself.
He became estranged from his family, he became homeless, he became violent.
Now that I remember, he always told me that he hated kids. One time, he put her in the closet and I got her out. He said that he was putting her in there for time out.
Boston police now knew who Baby Doe was. They had evidence to believe that the child had died in the house in Dorchester that Rochelle had shared with Michael McCarthy. But proving just who had done it and how it had occurred still needed to happen.
Once we got the information from Sprinsky and it appeared to check out, it was only a day or two before we decided to arrest Rochelle Bond.
Rochelle Bond was brought in for questioning. Although she didn't admit to killing her daughter, her testimony proved crucial to the police.
She was extremely emotional at the time of the arrest and had sort of a difficult time coming to grasp what was going on. However, we spent a significant amount of time with her, and she was able to provide us details that we later corroborated.
She realized, that if she did speak to us and she provided the story, that she was going to involve herself in a murder case, but she was torn between that, self-preservation, and the prospect of her daughter's murder going unsolved. In the end, she did speak to us. She told us that Bella was placed in a trash bag and then ultimately in a green duffel bag that was actually weighted down before the body was thrown into the Boston Harbor. Now, this was news to us. We had no knowledge of a green duffel bag. We had no knowledge of any weights. The only thing we had to work with was a green trash bag that had shown up on the beach. So when she was telling us that, truthfully, we were doubtful and we were skeptical that she wasn't telling us the truth. And we challenged her on that. And she was adamant, banging her fist on the table, saying that there was a green duffel bag and that there were weights. If that was the case, then we would have a duffel bag with weights, possibly at the original dump site. She had no specific location. It was really just a bunch of clues, South Boston, T Station, a park.
Police, however, were quickly able to verify her story.
Fortunately, Trooper Herman grew up in that area, and he had an idea of the area she was talking about. It was down by where the cruise ships leave. And we went back there the next day with divers, and when the diver went into the water, within 5 minutes he came to the surface and he gave us the thumbs up. He had found the bag and he had found the weights, and that was crucial evidence.
So how did the duffel bag remain unfound until the disclosure of its whereabouts by Rochelle Bond?
What happens when the human body decomposes? It produces gas that caused her body to rise back up to the surface. So it came out of the duffel bag. The tide carried her body out of the inner harbor and into the outer harbor and then across over to Deer Island, where on the tide it landed on the beach.
After interviewing Rochelle Bond, police moved in to arrest Michael McCarthy.
Michael McCarthy, when we found him, was in a hospital, and he provided us a story of not knowing what happened, and we ultimately were able to show that he was lying to us, not being truthful.
He freely spoke to the police on one or two occasions, but his stories were not consistent, and they lacked credibility. But he never admitted to doing anything to the child. In fact, one of his stories was that I came home one night and the child was gone, so I don't know what happened. I thought the child was either in the custody of the state or was in fact with the child's godparents or something like that. But so he just kept, he feigned any knowledge that even the child was missing.
Why would Rochelle tell us that you hurt her baby?
Maybe to cover her own ass if she was. There's nothing else I can think of. Why would Rochelle let me hurt her baby?
I'm asking you. We're asking you that question.
It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense to us why she would just pull your name out of a hat and say, Michael McCarthy hurt my baby.
Maybe because I was the only one around.
Yeah.
No one else was really around.
The trial of Michael McCarthy took place in February 2017. During the proceedings, Rochelle Bond alleged that McCarthy had punched the toddler in the stomach multiple times after claiming Bella was a demon and that he was the sole perpetrator of the murder.
I said, what the fuck did you do? You fucking killed her. And he said, no, it was her time to die. She was a demon.
One of our real heroes, Dave Deacon, the prosecutor on the case, he was just a shining example of what we expect in our prosecutors. He was utterly and thoroughly prepared. Dave's our real hero in this case. So Bella from the grave, she can't speak. Dave Deacon was her voice.
When we were talking about demonology and Satanism in the occult, he threw out a challenge and said, there is not one piece of evidence to suggest that Mr. McCarthy would ever do anything to harm a child. And I ask you to think back on the testimony of his lifelong friend, Michael Sprinsky. A name that if it came up in the defendant's closing, it wasn't mentioned very much, if you notice. Michael Sprinsky is in the front row. He was a friend of the defendant's since they were in 4th grade. And do you remember what he said when he testified that he told Rochelle Bond about his lifelong friend, Michael McCarthy? He said, "You have to get away from him. He's crazy."
McCarthy was very interested in the occult, very interested in demonology and Satanism and this sort of thing. And he had said it before that he thought that the little child was possessed.
He told me that Bella was possessed by demons. And I said, "Come on, will you? That child is not possessed by demons." I could see the change in his personality from he'd think that he was God at one point, and then the next day he'd think he was the devil. It was like a tug of war in his head of good and evil.
And the phone and text communication between Bella's mother and her partner revealed the true nature of his controlling influence over her.
We spent probably a day on the text messages between Rochelle and Michael McCarthy.
They were able to give us information as to the level of control and the level of knowledge that Michael McCarthy had.
He was coaching her on what to say, telling her not to tell people about Bella or what had happened with Bella, things that he was threatening her, and then that was evidence.
A lot of the cellular tower forensics, which showed McCarthy's path of movement at around the relevant period, corroborated Rochelle's testimony. The being around the Inner Harbor, driving over towards Melnia Cass in the Boston Medical Center area. These all corroborated what Rochelle was saying. That was very, very important.
As the trial progressed, details of what had happened to Bella were revealed by Rochelle.
She was struggling with Bella one night in early June. She sent McCarthy in to try to settle Bella. They were living all together at that point.
He goes into the room, some time passes, and Rochelle says that she walked in on him, hitting her, punching her.
How would you describe the force of that blow?
I don't know, I just saw her bounce off the bed.
What do you mean when you say bounce off the bed? Did she actually come off the bed?
Yeah, she bounced.
But did she bounce up and then come back down on the bed, or actually bounce off the bed?
No, she bounced up and came back down.
Her whole body? Did she react to other than her body bouncing, did she react to the punch at all?
No.
She tried to intervene, and that he knocked her out of the way. And by the time it was all over, she looked down and Bella was dead, limp on the ground.
What did you do?
So I think I yelled, what did you do?
Is that exactly what you yelled?
What the fuck did you do?
McCarthy said something along the lines of, "She's a demon. This is her time."
No one called 911. Somehow she ended up back in the living room on the couch, and Michael McCarthy was injecting her with drugs. And she claims she was just so high she doesn't remember it. Michael told her that he would kill her. But at that point, what do you have left to lose?
Did you think about running out of the apartment? Just running as fast as you could?
He was right there. I was scared.
What were you scared of?
Him.
And we believe for a period of days, if not longer, they put the child in a refrigerator to keep the corpse from decomposing at a rapid rate in the summer in Boston. And they went on a 3 or 4 day drug bender where they were just, shooting heroin morning, noon, and night.
Here were these two people shooting up drugs and out of control and stuffing this baby's body into the refrigerator and leaving it there for, they don't even remember how long, before deciding one day to get rid of it.
Eventually, McCarthy took Rochelle for a ride. Little did she know that Bella's remains were in the trunk of the car.
He drove with Rochelle and Bella's corpse to Quincy, where his father was living at the time. He got some weights, the kind of weights you use to exercise with. Had a duffel bag. He put the weights in the duffel bag. He put the body of the child in the duffel bag. He then tried to seal up the duffel bag, and then he brought the child to that area of South Boston, the Inner Harbor, where he was quite familiar with since from his teenage years, and he dropped the child into the water there.
The jury found Michael McCarthy guilty of second-degree murder, and he received a life sentence.
You upon your oaths do say that Michael McCarthy is guilty of murder in the second degree. So say you was 4 persons of the jury?
Yes.
So say you was all members of the jury?
Yes.
When it comes to kids, it's a different ball game. Like, anybody who does anything like that to a kid deserves the fullest extent of what's coming to them.
We may never know the full extent of Rochelle Bond's involvement in the murder of her child.
I find it hard to believe that a mother would just walk out of the room, allow the man who killed her daughter inject her with heroin, and then 3 days later, 72 hours later, be upset about it, but not enough to call the police.
Rochelle Bond escaped a custodial sentence.
She pled guilty to being an accessory after the fact, and for the larceny offenses for stealing the money that the child was receiving after her death. And she received a 2-year sentence for that.
And ultimately it was time served, but she was going to have to be on probation for a number of years afterwards.
The death of Bella Bond took its toll too on those involved in the investigation.
There was not one person that was there to protect that little girl, and she died needlessly.
Every homicide victim is important. Every homicide victim matters. And we realize how important our job is, but in a case with a 2-year-old little girl who nobody was calling for, yeah, it changed things a little bit for all of us.
I think everybody that was involved in the case was affected personally. People, after they've concluded their service as jurors, and I talked to them, I said, you got to see a side of our city that, few people get to see. It's a very safe city, it's a vibrant city, it's growing, people are moving here, but there is an underbelly. And, Michael McCarthy and Rochelle Bond and sadly, many others, occupy that space.
The case underlines the vital importance of forensics in modern-day crime solving.
20 years ago, probably without computers and barcodes and things of this nature, we probably wouldn't be able to do this sort of thing.
But it was the extraordinary work in visual profiling that was central to discovering the identity and hence the killer of Baby Doe.
We got so many calls when that composite was released from people all over the country and all over the world that were concerned that it was someone that they knew or loved that actually ended up in a trash bag on a beach.
Getting the composite of Baby Doe out 50 million times helped us identifying Bella.
We're able to use 3D technology and other forensic techniques to get a fairly accurate picture of her, almost identical, that you can then poster everywhere with. It generates a tip, and then you're able to go back several months after this occurred and pull things like latent prints and DNA evidence.
Police all across the United States and the world now understand how 21st century forensic techniques have significantly increased the chances of investigators tracking down criminals through their own forensic and genetic profiles.
Applying forensics on cases like Bella's is really critical to help provide guidance to law enforcement in regards to using it as an investigative tool.
This case wouldn't be solvable, I would hazard 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We didn't have this type of technology. that led us to this place. And absolutely, those advances are the reason why someone was held responsible for the death of this little girl.